We're on Daf Ayin Hey and Aleph on the top of the Amud, and we go back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, Ein Solin Esa Pesach, and it mentions Askala. An Askala is a kind of a grill. In Hebrew, it's called a tas shel barzel, a flat piece of iron, and the fire is underneath it. And then the Mishnah tells us a story about Rabbi Tzadok, who in turn tells us a story about Rabbi Gamliel, who says to his Eved, his trustworthy servant Tavi, say, Utzlei lanu es haPesach ala Askala. So the Gemara immediately asks, Maisa Listar. First, you formulate a principle, and then you bring a story that contradicts that principle. How can you open up and tell me that we don't roast the Pesach on Askala, and then tell me that, in fact, Rabbi Gamliel told his Eved and instructed him to roast the Pesach on an Askala? And the Gemara answers, Isuri mechzer of achiton. We have to add something to the text of the Mishnah. And we should read the Mishnah in the following way. Ein solinus a Pesach ala Askala ve'im Askala menukeves mutter. If you have an Askala, which is not a solid, flat piece of metal, but rather it has holes in it, it's perforated, which means that it's really like in a sense, a frame, and it's got, shall we call it, poles, so to speak, small poles of metal that are set up one next to the other across the entire width of the Askala, and the open space between each one of these strips of metal is large enough so that when you place the meat of the Korban Pesach on top of the spit, then the Pesach is in effect suspended in air between these different motos, as they call them in Hebrew, and it never really comes in contact directly with the barza. That's called menukeves, and that's mutter. And to prove this, the Mishnah demonstrates the story of Rabbi Gamliel that he told his Eved to roast the Pesach on an Askala menukeves. Now, I wanted to read just a footnote here in the English translation, and we're here on Daf Ayin Hey, and we're trying to understand this perforated grill, as we called it. And he says the following, that the grill consisted of a series of bars. That's what we called motos. And this is not the same as what we would call a modern day grill, which has perforations, but rather it's a series of bars. There was a large space between the bars so that the spit, the shipud, could be placed across that open space, and the Pesach was suspended there without touching any of the bars. Since the Pesach itself does not touch the metal, therefore it could be roasted, and it's called sli in this particular fashion. Now, what exactly is the chidush here of Askala and the story of Rabbi Gamliel? Why would we think otherwise if at the end of the day, the Pesach is actually suspended in midair and doesn't come in contact with any of the bars? He says that the novelty in this ruling is that we need not be concerned with the possibility that someone might come to place the Pesach on the surface of a regular grill and roast it there. A regular grill means like a grill that simply has perforations, because then the Pesach has direct contact with the metal, and that's not called sli. And at the end of this footnote, he quotes a Rambam in Hilchos Korban Pesach, Perek Shmon, the eighth Perek, and the Rambam seems to go a step further and imply that you can be matir even a case where the Korban Pesach rests directly on the surface of the grill, as long as the grill is perforated, which means that the perforations are large enough to let the fire go through. So that means that as long as the fire pierces through these perforations, the Rambam holds, that makes the Korban Pesach into tzolui. Now, you and I would say, and that's Rashi's Shita, that the tzliya of this Pesach, in the case of a perforated grill, is a twofold power. It's A plus B joining together. In other words, the resulting roasting is not just because the H penetrates through the perforations, but it's also a result of the direct contact between the lamb and the surface of the grill. Rashi is of the opinion that since and once there's a direct connection or contact point between the Korban Pesach and the hot metal of the grill, that already undermines the status of tzli. It's not a complete tzli. The Rambam, on the other hand, holds that we can call it tzli as long as there is tzli, even if there's more than tzli, even though there's another variable in the equation, and part of the roasting is a result of the metal, but nevertheless, as long as we have direct contact, and we have to add one other point to explain the Rambam. The Rambam is telling us that if there was no contact, because there is contact, but even if there wouldn't have been contact, theoretically, the fire has enough of an opening in the perforation of the grill so that it itself, on its own, could roast the lamb. That gives it a prime status. The Aish is now considered the primary element that's contributing to the ultimate result of tzli. So the Rambam is putting the emphasis on what we call totzaas hamaisa, the ultimate result. And he says that the ultimate result is that the H is piercing through the perforations and is in direct contact with the Korban Pesach. On the other hand, Rashi's Shita is that it's not enough to talk about the ultimate result, but we also have to analyze the Maisa tzli. We need what's called a tsuras tzli. And in the case where the Korban Pesach is not suspended in midair on a spit above the fire, the open fire, that's not a tsuras tzli. You are laying down the Korban Pesach on a tas shel barzel, on a flat surface, a grill. That's not tsuras tzli. Whereas the Rambam is saying, forget about tsuras tzli. Let's just look at the final outcome. And at the end of the day, tachlis, it is the fire that's burning and roasting the Korban Pesach. That's enough. And therefore, the Rambam and Rashi have this machlokas about what exactly is this case of askala, which the Gemara qualifies as askala menukeves. And Rashi says that if it's a regular askala, just that it has perforation, then you're basically using a grill, and that's not tzli as far as Pesach is concerned. The Rambam says, I don't care whether you're using a grill or not, as long as the H goes directly through the perforations. And therefore, the Rambam is willing to say that askala menukeves is exactly what it says. It's an askala, it's a grill, it's a flat piece of metal, and it's got perforations. Rashi reinterprets this sugya. And he says that the askala is a different kind of askala. It's a totally different entity. It's got these motos, these bars, that have a space in between them, and he puts the shiput on the top of these bars. And that leads us to the question, why the Mishnah had to be machadish me. What discovery and what great revelation is Mishnah telling me if at the end of the day, the Korban Pesach, even in the case of Askala, is being suspended over the Eish? And the answer is that we might be afraid that if we allow him to use the Askala in that particular form of an Askala, where the motos are carrying the shipud and the lamb is being suspended over the fire, he may come to use a different kind of a grill, which doesn't have these vertical motos, these bars, but rather it's flat, and that would not be tzli. So Kamash Malan, we're not afraid of such a thing. Okay. Now we start a major sugya. Now, just by way of introduction, what we have to know is that the Gemara back on Daf Chavav Amid Beis recorded a dispute between Rebbe and the Chachamim about the principle of Shvach Eitzim Bipas. What happens? He takes Arla, in this case, klipos of Arla, like walnuts. Walnuts are Arla, they grow on trees, and for the first 3 years, you're not allowed to have any benefit, neither from the nut itself or from the covering the shell over the nut. The shell of a walnut is so tough that it can be used as fuel, as a substitute for logs in a campfire. So what did he do? He used Kalipe Arla to heat up his oven. Then he went ahead and baked a dough, baked a loaf of bread in that oven that's heated by the fire that's coming from the Kalipe Arla. And here we have a major machlokas. If you hold yesh shvach eitzim b'pas, meaning when you eat that bread, you are benefiting from the eitzim, from the fuel that generated the fire that heated up the oven, that baked your bread. So we go through the entire Chad Gadol. He took Kalipe Arla, used them to generate a fire. The fire, therefore, heats up the oven. The dough is now being baked by the heat of the oven. And the benefit that he gets when he eats that baked bread is from the Kalipe Arla. Because if not for the Kalipe Arla, he would not have a bread that's baked. That's called yesh shvach eitzim b'pas. It's as if every bite of every morsel that he tastes from this piece of bread, he is benefiting from the Kalipe Arla. The other man, the Omer says, ein shvach eitzim b'pas. You're allowed to eat this bread. And the reason for that is because the relationship between your hanah, when you eat the bread, and the burning of the Kalipe Arla is so far removed that we cannot consider as if your hanah is miyuchas, is related to the burning of the Kalipe Arla. And the Gemara offers another possibility in the sugya back on Daf Chavav, that the fire itself comes not from the Kalipe Arla, but from the burnt Kalipe Arla. In other words, the fire rises as the combustion of the Kalipe Arla is occurring, so that we don't define the fire as the Kalipe Arla. They're two separate entities. And therefore, when he benefits from that fire, insofar as it heats up his oven, he's not considered violating the Isur Hanah. Rebbe is of the opinion that yesh shvach eitzim b'pas, and an oven that was heated up by the klipos of Arla, or the Gemara gives other examples, Rimonim, that pas is asura, and the Chacham disagree. They permit you to eat the pas. And keep in mind, the chiddush of the Chachamim is that the eish that is heating up the oven is still, I should say, the klipos that the eish is attached to are still intact. Bi'od sha'eish dolekes biklipasa. And yet the Rabbanan say that's mutter. because, as we said before, the benefit that he gets from the bread is only indirectly related to the Kalipe Arla themselves, even though the Kalipe Arla are alive and well, so to speak. I mean, you can see them as the fire is shooting up from the Kalipe Arla. Now, how does this impact on our sugya of Ketzad Solim? We're going to ask the question whether or not you can heat up the oven with fire, and then, while the oven is hot, remove the fire from the oven and roast your korban pesach. The roasting is now indirectly related to the eish. There is no direct linkage between the eish and the korban pesach. It's an indirect link because the eish heated up the oven, and the heat now is trapped inside the oven. I put the lamb in, and it roasts in the heat that came from the eish. But there's no direct relationship between the eish and the korban pesach. Boy mine Rav Chinina ar Idi mi Rav Ada bar Ava tanur sheisiko beklipe arla ugrafo. So I can't tell you how important that word ugrafo is. The Afa Boas Apas, and now we have to introduce Rebbe Shita. So Rebbe Shita is that if you bake a bread in an oven that was heated up by Klipe Arla, you're not allowed to benefit from this loaf of bread because you're benefiting from Arla, and Arla is also Hanea. But that's a case where the fire is burning the Klipe Arla as the bread is being baked. Our case is Ugrafa. Right, you remember the mission at the beginning of Kira and the Garuf and the Katu, right? Grafo means he sweeps it out. So the Klipe Arla that were burnt and created this fire in the tanur were now removed from the oven. And what we're left with is the heat that was produced by the H of the Klipe Arla. But the Klipe Arla nowhere to be seen. It's just the heat that's trapped in the walls of the oven. Is l'divrei oser mahu. What's the status of this pas that was heated by Klipe Arla, but only after the Klipe Arla was swept out of the oven? And now the relationship between the pas and the Arla is even more far removed than Rebbe Shita back on Daf Chavav, because at least in the case of Rebbe, Yesh Lachetzav Pas, we're talking about Klipe Arla that now are burning inside the oven, so that the baked bread is a result of the Klipe Arla. And if you want to create a relationship between the Isur Hanea, the Chefta of the Isur Hanea, and the object which was created or benefited from the Isur Hanea, you see that relationship right in front of your eyes, because the fire that's baking the dough is coming from Klipe Arla. But what happens, and that's the suffix here of Rab Chinina, when I remove the Klipe Arla from the oven, I sweep them out. What I'm left with is the heat that was produced by the Klipe Arla. Amalei, so Rav Ada bar Ava responds to Rav Chinina, Hapas muteres. That far, Rebbe didn't go. So when the Klipe Arla inside the oven and they are producing the eish, then the dough that's baked by that heat that's coming directly from the fire, which is directly from the Klipe Arla, and it's all inside the oven, that's an Isur Hanea. Then we consider as if you're benefiting from the Klipe Arla. But Rebbe would agree that if you did a garuf situation, even though the heat that remains inside the oven that's baking your bread is the heat that was generated by the Klipe Arla, but that's already one step far removed. Now, you'll take a look for a moment at Tosas Divra Maschil Ugrafo, and we're not going to go through the whole Tosfos, but basically, Tosfos, if I could reduce it to its primary elements, its highlights, is bothered by the following question: why does Gemara have a suffix about the bread that was baked in the oven after they shoveled out the Kilipi Arla? The Brisa quotes, again, the other half of this Brisa is back on Daf Chavav, the machlokas between Rebbe and Chachamim, and he put in that machlokas the pas inside the oven that was being burned and heated by the Kilipi Arla. And the Kilipi Arla at that point were already burnt, as we said earlier. So the combustion that produced this heat had already done its job. And you could look at the Kilipi Arla and see them as gechalim, as coals. And the Brisa says that Rebbe makes the following distinction. If the Kilipi Arla is still intact and the fire is shooting up from the Kilipi Arla and heating up the dough, then yeshvach eitzim v'pas. But Rebbe says that if we get to the point when the Kilipi Arla have already been converted, transformed into gechalim, and the heat is coming up from these coals, which are Kilipi Arla coals, then Rebbe says the pas is muteres. Is if that be the case, what is the Gemara raising here? What is the question of Chidina? With a Kal V'chomer, it should certainly be muteres. He didn't have to ask Rav Ada bar Ava for an answer to that question. It's written in the Mishnah itself. I shouldn't say the Mishnah because it's actually a Brisa. But the Brisa goes on to say that Rebbe concedes that in a case where the Kilipi Arla have already been converted into gechalim, then if he bakes his bread, how much more so if he removed the Kilipi Arla from the tanur? Kolshkein yesh lahatir pasha nefsa betanur achar shegarfa mimenos haklipos. And Tosfos gives the following answer. Yeshlomi says haklipos, after they became gechalim, are panim chadoshes bo'olakan. The entity of Arla is non-existent. The shame Arla and the shame Chefta D'Isura is completely gone. It doesn't exist anywhere in the world. It's ki afra bi alma, and it's mutar b'ana. Therefore, the gechalim are mutar b'ana because the gechalim mean and signify the death, so to speak, of the Arla. The Arla is dead. It's dead and buried. It doesn't exist anymore. The gechalim is a new entity. What should I say? It would be like stealing someone's Kilipi Arla and then converting them to coal by burning them. He would be kona b'shinui. Right? The Gemara gives the example where he steals chitim and he makes it into flour. Avol b'tanur shenigraf, in the context of Reb Chanina's Safek, and asahi me'achom sheba mishal heves shedolka bi'atzei isur. Let's go over this. So MaMasechet here. He says that although he shoveled out the Kilipi Arla from the tanur, but nevertheless, he's benefiting from the heat that was the burning Atzei Arla, meaning the Atzei Arla were not yet coals when they produced the Aish. And therefore, even if the coals have been removed from the tanur, of Chinin is of the opinion, or at least one side, that he's benefiting from Kilipi Arla because the very heat that will bake his bread is coming from the Aish of Kilipi Arla. The Arla has not yet been transformed into coals. And it's a very strange two rules, so to speak, two rulings, I should call it. One ruling says that if the Kilipi Arla is still in the oven, the bread is mutter. And the other ruling says that despite the fact that the kilifi arla had been removed from the oven, the bread is us. And the answer is that in the first case, although the kilifi arla is still in the oven, but they're not there anymore, they are completely dead and buried. History. Ponim chadoshes. It's now gir chalil. Masha'enken, in the case of garaf, the fire itself that's heating and baking your bread is the fire of kilifi arla before they became gir chalil. And Rav Ada answers, hapas muteres. Nevertheless, you're allowed to eat the pas because we have to have a visual relationship between the pas that you're eating and benefiting from and the mahana, which is the chefza di Isory Hanah of Arla, and we don't have any connection visually. We just know that the H came from the kilifi arla, but where are the kilifi arla? They're not to be found. And this proves what we've said many times, that Isory Hanah means it's an Isur Chefza, meaning your Hanah has to be related to the Chefza. What you're doing, in effect, is you're taking that object, taking that Chefza, which is also Hanah, and you're benefiting from it. Like, for example, the Gemara in the same sugya there on Chav Vav says that if you pass by a monastery and they are burning incense to their deities and you smell the incense, the Gemara says that's not a violation of Isory Hanah mi'avodah zarah. Because what happens is that the incense produces whatever chemicals are in the air that give you a smell. That's if you didn't have corona anyway. And you smell and benefit from the incense. And the Gemara says it's mutter. Why? Because you're not considered to have taken from the chefza, from the avodah zarah itself, and taken it for your hanah. There's a halacha requirement of lekichas hanah. So when do I say, according to Rav Ada, this lekichas hanah? That's only if the chefza di surah is there. It's right there, and you could say he's taking those kilifi arla, so to speak, figuratively, into his hands and benefiting from them. But if it's garaf, then although there's an indirect benefit from the kilifi arla insofar as the heat that bakes his bread is coming from kilifi arla, but there's no relationship to the chefza di surah. He severed that relationship, and he's not considered a lokeach chefza d'hanah. So far, we're doing okay. But now, the going gets rough. Rav Chinna did not take this answer sitting down. He was anything but a happy camper. How could you possibly say, Rav Ada, that a person bakes his bread in an oven that was heated up by Isory Hanah, and simply because he removes the Isory Hanah, it's mutter? Va'amar Rav Chinna Saba. Again, this is not the same Rav Chinna that we had before. The first Rav Chinna was Rav Chinna Bar Idi. Now we have Rav Chinna Saba, the elder. Omar Rav Asi, Omar Rav Yochanan, Tanur Sheisiko, Vigrafo, Vitzolobo es a Pesach, Ein Zet Sli H. Unbelievable. I'm so nispal, Rabbos, I have to tell you, I get very emotional about this because how Korban Pesach and Sli becomes what we call in the Hebrew, Keresh Kfitza, the starting point for so many halachas. We had a whole sugya for 2 days that we studied about the laws of Malicha and how Tzli could substitute for Malicha, and what happens if you put one piece of meat inside another piece of meat, and it was never Malicha, and we derived it from Korban Pesach, according to Rabbi Yossi Aglili, because they put one meat inside the other meat. And now we are going to derive conclusions about Isurei Hanah from Slias HaPesach. Now, keep in mind, Slias HaPesach has nothing to do with Isurei Hanah. But what we're going to define is Sli. And the law in Sli is that if you remove the eitzim that are being used to fuel up your fire that's roasting your carbon Pesach, is Rabbi Yochanan says, Ein zet Sli eish. You've got to have a direct relationship between your object that's you're benefiting, right? The chefza shenene, which in this case is the Pesach, that has to become Sli, and the Kalipe Arla, so to speak. What I mean is the eitzim that are producing the fire. And he took the eitzim out of the oven. Wait a second. That would be the greatest proof to Rav Idi. This is like 2 drops of water. Why is Rav Chinina getting upset at Rav Idi? Rav Chinina should have said, Tana de Messiah. I want to quote a brisa in Hilchas Karban Pesach. In this case, it's not a brisa, it's actually a member of Rabbi Yochanan. That's going to be perfectly analogous to your case and to your ruling as a proof to your chiddush that this pas that was baked after Garuf by Kalipe Arla, etc., is mutter. You're allowed to benefit from it. And I'm going to prove it to you from Rabbi Yochanan's statement. Because Rabbi Yochanan's statement is that although you created a fire with eitzim, and with this fire you roasted the Karban Pesach, it's possible. Why? Because you removed the eitzim from the oven. And that already severs the relationship, the connection between the Karban Pesach and the Eish of eitzim. The eitzim have to produce a fire. Tanur sheisiko, and we'll add the word be eitzim. So he heated up, he fired up his oven with wood, which again, like a campfire, you burn the wood. Ugrafo. Now he's got the heat of the eish trapped in the oven. He roasts his Karban Pesach inside the oven that has the trapped heat that was produced by Atzei Eish. Pesach ein zet Sli Eish. You're not allowed to eat that Karban Pesach because it's not Sli. Because we need that the fire be there, generating the heat of the roasting process. And if the fire is not there because he removed the atzei or H, meaning the logs of wood that are burning, he removed them from the oven, then guess what? That's not called Sli. Why is Rav Chinina quoting Rav Yochanan as a proof against Rav Ada instead of as a proof in favor of Rav Ada? And the answer is because this halacha that when the Eish is burning outside the tanur and grafa, it's not Sli. Das is a besondere halacha in Hilchos Karban Pesach. That's only a halacha that's unique, what the briskets call a din miyuchad, in Karban Pesach. And I'll prove it to you. I'm going to prove to you that Karban Pesach is not the rule, but rather the exception to the rule. Because Rav Yochanan, if you don't stop him in the middle of a sentence, says shenemar, because the Torah repeats twice, Sli Eish. Let's go through the 2 psukim. It says, again, this is all in Parshas Bo, V'achluas habasar b'layla zet Sli Eish, once. And then it says, Al tochlu mimenu na umevushal ki im sliesh. Why did you repeat sliesh? Shtei pa'amim. Says Rabbi Yochanan that the extra sliesh is not redundant. It's coming to teach me a gewaldige chiddush. That you need the eish to be there in the oven, and the Korban Pesach is being roasted on that eish. If you remove the eish itself, it's not called sliesh. But that's a separate halacha in Korban Pesach, derived from the extra words sliesh. Taima, why does Rabbi Yochanan disqualify this sliya? The Goli Rachmana, the Torah says sliesh shtei piyamim. What would be the universal rule if we don't have that extra ribui? Halo Goli Rachmana, avamina. Now, when he says havamina, what he means here by it's a little tricky. Havamina is not something that we're rejecting. We're rejecting it in Korban Pesach. It's called a havamina, but is the rule that governs all other dinim. And what is that rule? Sliesh. This would be considered sliesh. Where's the eish? The answer is the eish has done its job, heated up the oven, and it's still considered sliesh. Where's the eish? There's no eish. But the havamina was that Korban Pesach should be judged under the universal principles of tzli, and according to those principles, even in the absence of the eitzim that are burning the eish is nowhere to be found. All you have is the result of the eish, and that means you have the heat that's trapped in the oven. That would constitute tzli. And we consider as if the tzli is coming from the eish. Where is the eish? It's outside the oven. It doesn't matter. We're going to look at not the presence of the eish. Where is the eish? I don't see it. It's outside the oven. Where's the relationship between that which I'm baking or roasting in the oven and the eish? We're not going to ask those questions. All we have to know is that the heat is coming from the eish. And therefore in Korban Pesach, havamina, if not for the extra pasuk tzli eish, we would derive the conclusion that this is a perfect roasting, even though the eish is nowhere in the tanur. Now, Rabbosai, we can begin to appreciate Rav Chinina's kasha on Rav Ada Barav. Says Rav Chinina from Rav Yochanan's drasha, we conclude that although Korban Pesach is the exception to the rule, the universal rule would be that something is considered sliesh even in the absence of the eish. So therefore, the fire that's burning from the kilipi arla, which is now heating up the oven, sets up a baking process in which the pas is a result of the tzliesh, so to speak, meaning of those kilipi arla that generated the eish. And therefore, it should be asur b'hana. Why did you, Rav Ada, poo-poo my question? Says Rav Chinina. He's very insulted. I asked you a very intelligent question. My question was based on the fact that with the exception of Korban Pesach, we could take the eish and the source of the eish out of the oven, and it's still considered as if the baking or the roasting is related to the eish itself. The eish is an eish of kilipi arla. Who cares if it was gara? And he took the kilipi arla out. Now, Rabbosai, the first thought that crossed my mind, and I don't know if you could identify with me, is that who says that Korban Pesach is a bezuder Allah, is the exception to the rule? Maybe we were vacillating back and forth, just as Rav Chinina himself was vacillating forth, and we didn't know. Is this called sliesh? Is it not called sliesh? The Torah is teaching me in the context of Korban Pesach that this is not called sliesh. So when Rav Ada Barav paskins that you're allowed to eat the bread because the kilipi arla are outside of the oven, he was basing himself on an analogy to Korban Pesach. From Van Weisman, who told you that Korban Pesach is the exception to the rule? Adarab. Let's make Korban Pesach into a binyan av. And it teaches me that we shouldn't vacillate back and forth and begin to believe that you could have tzli eish when there's no H over there, because there was an H, but the H was removed. And therefore, the Korban Pesach is osur b'achila. It's not solely because you took the Eish out, the atze Eish, with the Eish coming out of the Eitzim, outside of the Tanur. And therefore, the same thing is going to apply in Kilipi Arla. That it's not considered as if you were roasting, or in this case, baking your bread from the Kilipi Arla, because the Kilipi Arla are outside the Tanur. That's what occurred to my mom. And I honestly, I was a little bit nervous about this until I read the next line of the Gemara. Amalei, Rav Ada responds, Gali Rachmana Hasan, V'alfina Mineh. Why are you getting all so heated up by this oven of Rabbi Yochanan in Korban Pesach? Korban Pesach now becomes your paradigmic case to set up your definition of tzli, and the same thing will apply to afiyah. And it tells you that if the eish is gone and all you're left with is the heat of the eish, that's not tzli, and that's not afiyah. And two nafkaminas. One in terms of the mitzvah of tzli in Korban Pesach, and the other in terms of the iser of hanah in Kilipi Arla. In terms of the mitzvah of tzli, the Torah has already told you that once the eish was removed from the oven and all you're left with is the heat of the eish, that is not considered tzli. You did not fulfill your requirement, the obligation of tzli. And in the case of an oven that was heated up by Kilipi Arla, and now you bake your bread in the heat of that oven, that's not considered hanah from the Kilipi Arla, because it's not related to the eish of the Kilipi Arla. And when does Rebbe say yesh v'acheitzim b'pas? That's only when you have the eish coming directly from the Kilipi Arla, baking your bread. Now, I think what's going on here is that, again, I don't know if this is Rav Ada bar Rava himself or it's the Gemara, but somebody is not so convinced and comfortable with the first answer. Because why would the Torah find the location, the right place within the entire Torah to teach me this halacha, which is Nogea to Isory Hanah in general, tucked away in the mitzvah of tzli eish by repeating the word tzli eish twice? Sounds like this is not the rule, but rather Pesach is the exception to the rule. And therefore the Gemara offers another answer to this question. Ibois Ema Hasam, in the case of Korban Pesach, Taima, the reason why it's not called tzli, in a case of a Tanur Garuf, where you remove the Atze Ha'esh from the oven, is Mishum de Kasa Rachmana Tzli Eish Shtei Pa'amim. Halo Kasa Rachmana Tzli Eish Shtei Pa'amim. I would have said that even though he was Garif the Tanur, he could be roasted, he would consider roasting the Pesach in the hot Tanur. But you know what? That Havamina, that I would consider it as tzli, is a specific Havamina in Korban Pesach. In other words, when Rav Chinina asked this question from Rabbi Yochanan, based on Rabbi Yochanan to Rav Ada, he understood that the maskana was a special halacha in Korban Pesach, and as a general rule, this would have been considered tzli, and in the case of afiyah, it will be considered afiyah, even though he was goref outside the tanur. Now the Gemara in the Ibois Ema is saying that there's a unique halacha in Korban Pesach, but not the maskana, but rather as a havamina. In Korban Pesach, we would have a havamina to think that this was tzli, and it would constitute tzli. Why? Havamina eish kapid rachmana. Now, the word Eish here is a little bit tricky. But really what it means is Chom ha'Eish. In other words, the Torah doesn't want you to cook the Korban Pesach. Because if you cook the Korban Pesach, then it's the water that's having the impact on the Pesach. You heated up the water, you put the meat inside the water, and you cook the meat. That the Torah excludes. What's the flip side? What does the Torah want of us? It wants the roasting process to come from an Eish. Who cares where the Eish is? That's irrelevant. The Eish inside and outside, a hin, a hair. I just want to know that the Korban Pesach was a roasted Pesach, which means that it was roasted by virtue of an Eish, as opposed to metal, as opposed to hot water, etc. Well, let's be honest about it. Even in the case of Gorah, am I going to deny that the Korban Pesach was roasted by Eish? I mean, what's roasting the Korban Pesach, if not the Eish? Whether the Eish is inside the tanur or outside the tanur. Is therefore, if the Torah is makbid on Eish, and again, we're not interested now in the Eitzim per se, because we're not dealing with Kalipe Arla, which is also about no. We're dealing with Eish. The Torah wants a roasting of the Korban Pesach by Eish. Is Grafo Nami Tzli Eishu? Has anything changed? What changed when he removed the Eish from the oven? Garnish. Nothing changed. Whether the Eish is actually in the oven or outside the oven, the heat of the Eish is responsible for the roasting of the lamb. And that makes it into Tzli Eish. That's why the Torah had to go out of its way to tell me, I have a chiddush, I have news for you. Tzli Eish Pamayim. I am limiting Tzli Eish to the case where the Eish is there and the Korban Pesach is now being roasted directly from the Eish and not from the heat of the Eish. We've now shifted our definition from Tzli Eish to a different kind of Tzli Eish. Tzli Eish number one, which was the Havamina, if not for the drasha, the miut of Tzli Eish Pamayim, means that the Tzli is a result of Eish. Where is the Eish? Irrelevant. It was roasted by fire. Comes along the Torah with another Tzli Eish to tell you that in Korban Pesach we require a higher level, so to speak. More conditions have to be met in order for it to qualify as Tzli Eish. And the additional condition is that the Eish is right there, directly roasting the Korban Pesach on top of the Eish. That's called Tzli Eish when you have Tzli Eish Pamayim. But was there ever a Havamina in the case of Isouri Hanah, says Ravado, that you would be considered benefiting from Kalipe Arla, there are no Kalipe Arla in the oven. He's not benefiting from Kalipe Arla. So again, if your definition is Eish, I couldn't care less. The Eish is inside, the Eish is outside. It matters not. The meat is being roasted by Eish. And the Torah now jacks up the conditions for qualifying as Tzli Eish in Korban Pesach by repeating it twice and saying that no, it's not enough to say it was roasted by fire. We have to have the fire directly underneath the Korban Pesach. But as far as Kalipe Arla is concerned, I don't need any shtei pa'amim in order to exclude a case of garaf when the Kalipe Arla are nowhere to be found and all you're left with is the Eish. The Torah is makbid on the Kalipe Arla. That's called Ha'etzim di surah kakapid rachmana v'holesnu. Beautiful sugya. If you don't mind, I just want to review the sugya outside, oisavedic, as we say. Beautiful, beautiful sugya. Like if you're teaching like Talmudic methodology, this would be like a perfect example as a training ground. I'm trying to learn how to edit a video, so I need a tutorial. This would be a tutorial in Talmudic methodology. Rav Chinina opens up by vacillating with regard to Isory Anov Kalipi Arla. What happens if he removes the Kalipi Arla from the oven at the time that he bakes the bread in the oven with the heat of the Kalipi Arla, but the Kalipi Arla nowhere to be found? They've been removed from the oven. Do we say that he is indirectly benefiting from the Kalipi Arla, and Rebbe has already the position of Shvach Eitzim B'Pas? Or do we say no? Rebbe only says Shvach Eitzim B'Pas because the Kalipi Arla are burning inside the oven, and the fire is coming directly up from the Kalipi Arla. But if the Kalipi Arla had been removed, Rebbe would agree it's mutter. Says Rav Ada bar Ava, forget about your question. There's nothing to vacillate about. It's clear that this would be mutter according to Rebbe. Rebbe only went far as answering it when the Kalipi Arla are there. So Rav Chinina says, wait a second. Rabbi Yochanan derives the exact same conclusion that you did in the case of Korban Pesach, but he needed a drasha for that, to set up Korban Pesach as the exception to the rule rather than the rule, because it says Tzli Eish Shtei Piyamim. And had it said Tzli Eish only once, then we would consider this Tzli despite the absence of the Atzei Ha'esh in the oven. And the Gemara defends Rav Idi in two different ways. The first way is Adarabah. Instead of classifying Korban Pesach as the exception to the rule, let's upgrade it to the rule and let's use it as a binyan av. And the Torah's extra tzliyesh is teaching you that in Korban Pesach we have this very, very unique halacha of upgrading the status of Tzli Eish. But in general, even without the Shtei Pa'amim, we would come to. And the second answer to the Gemara is no. In the case of Korban Pesach, I would have had a Havamina that maybe this is called in a broader definition of Tzli. It's called Tzli even if the Kalipi Arla, as I say, or rather the Atzei Ha'esh are removed from the oven, because at the end of the day, it's Tzli and it's not Bishul. But here, in the case of Kalipi Arla, clearly the Torah is makpid on having Anoah from the Kalipi Arla. We learned in the Brisa. Now, here's an interesting question the Gemara is going to ask. Are you allowed to take a Korban Pesach and roast it on coals, not on a fire? The Brisa says chatocho, and again, the Rishonim are very careful. It doesn't mean that he cut up the Korban Pesach into small pieces, because tzli has to encompass the entire Korban Pesach, but rather he makes chatachim, he makes certain incisions, and that'll speed up the process of roasting, but it's still whole, it's still intact. Now, this brisa only records the shita of Rebbe. Rebbe Omer Anisha Zet Sli Eish, even though it was not roasted directly on a fire, but rather on coals, the status of coals is equivalent to that of an Eish. Rami Le Rav Achtevoy Bar Imi Le Rav Chizd Miyama Rebbe Gecholim Eish Ninu. Can we reconcile Rebbe's position here with regard to Gecholim, that they have the status of Eish Ureminu? And now we learn the Parsha of Negoim, and in the Parsha Negoim, one of Nigei Aguf is called Michva, or Michvas Eish. His flesh was burnt, never. And the Kohen came to see this nega called Kvia, which has its own dinam in Negoim. You really have to know Negoim for this, but in any event, he sees that this mikvah continues to lurk on, so to speak. And the Brisa says, it says mikvas eish. Now, there are many different ways that a person can burn themselves. It doesn't have to be directly from a fire. Is ainli ella nichve be'eish. Maybe the tzaras of mikvah only applies to a burn from a fire. What will we say about the following list, enumerated list of other kinds of burns? Nichve begacheles, beremetz. Right, remetz means that there are ashes, hot ashes. Sid roseach, a kind of a lime that was absolutely burning. Begifsis, which is another kind of, how do you say in English, sid? Samach Yudalid, plaster, we'll call it. Or kol davar haba min ha'or, anything that was heated up by fire, but it's not itself fire, right? So you heated up the gechalim, or the efaroseach, or the sid roseach, etc. And now the Gemara takes a sort of a little bit of a detour, and asks the question: why did the Brisa say kol davar haba min ha'or lasuye? What is that coming to include? Chame ha'or, which means boiling hot water. You put on the fire and the water is boiling, and now the water spills on his body, he gets a mikvah. Now the Gemara goes back to the Brisa itself. Minayin, how do I know that in any of those cases of something that was heated up by H, and then he burnt himself on that second object, it's also considered Negoyim, and it's Mitame Tumas Tzaras as mikvah? Talmud Lomar mikvah riba. The Torah says mikvah twice. There are two parshios in the Goyim. One in Vayikra Yigimel, it says tzaras mikvah v'tzaras shchin. So wait a minute, where's the, just one second. Oh, here it is. It says, Ki yeh ba'oro michvas eish, and then it says, V'hoisa michyas hamichva. The second word michva in this pasuk is completely redundant. It could have just said, V'hoisa michyasa. But therefore, we assume, without a shadow of a doubt, that the second mikvah is coming for a drasha to teach me that it doesn't require kvias eish directly from the fire, but mikvas eish should be expanded to include anything that was heated up by the fire and then he got burnt. That's called mikvah. So the Gemara analyzes this brisa. Taima, the only reason why Rebbe has an expanded scope for mikvah is because what? The Rabbi Rachmana mikvah, the extra word mikvah that we said was totally unnecessary. Hello, Rabbi Rachmana mikvah. In the absence of that extra ribui, all the cases that we listed would not qualify as mikvah for the tumas taras of mikvah. And on the list, we have gacheles. Is we have to derive from this the conclusion that the cholim lav eish ninu, because mikvah means mifas eish, and you need a special ribui to include gecholim. Obviously, gecholim is not called eish. So how could Rebbe say they could be yotzei the mitzvah of tzli eish by putting the korban pesach on top of coals? Amalei. So Rav Chizda responds to Rav Achterboy, Gacheles shall eitz lo itzrich kroy l'ribuye. If he had taken a piece of wood and burnt it down to coals, then for sure that would be considered eish. And in the case of a Korban Pesach, it would be tzli eish if he put it on coals that were burnt wood. Ki, it's rikra, but when do we say it's not called eish? That's le gachele shel mateches, where he heated up a piece of metal with fire, and now he gets burnt with that hot burning piece of metal, and we need a special ribui for that case to include it on the mikvah, because mikvah means eish, and for that we have the extra word mikvah to l'rabos, even gecholim shel mateches. But in the case of Korban Pesach, the gacheles of eish includes a gacheles of eitz. If you took wood, you burnt it, and you converted it to coals, those coals are considered tzli eish when he roasts his Korban Pesach on the tzli eish. You'll tell me we need a special pasuk for gecholim in the case of mikvah. The answer is because that's a case of gecholim of mateches, not a gecholim shel eitz. And the Gemara now is going to analyze this distinction between gecholim shel mateches, which is not eish, and gecholim shel eitz. In the case of gecholim shel eitz, it's really the fire that's burning in the wood that is going to be responsible for your roasting. Masha'en came in the case of barzel, of something that's made of metal, the heat comes from the eish, but now the metal itself conducts the eish, and the heat, it now becomes an independent source for burning. And therefore in Korban Pesach, it would not be tzli. And in the case of mikvah, if not for the extra pasuk mikvah, it would not be considered mikvah eish. And that's what we're going to pick up in Mirza Shem tomorrow, Bli Neder. So we're up, I should say Yom Rishon, so up to V'gecholim shel mateches lav eshu. Here, towards, I would say, 2/3 down the Amud of Daf Ayin Hey Amanal. So let me take this opportunity to wish everyone a great Shabbos Parshas Va'era, and thank you for a very, very productive week. I think so far, B'li Ayin Hara, the experiment of Ketzad Solon has been successful, and it's amazing to me how we're learning like Kol HaTorah Kula from the perspective of Tzli Eish in Korban Pesach. Thank you so much.